Now, I do want to then introduce our speaker, Tom Smith. And Tom Smith I owe a lot to because he was on the committee that recruited me to be the director of the Institute. And I remember his words just before I took on the job. Oh, come on, you'll have fun. Thanks a lot, Tom. Actually, I have had a lot of fun. And Tom, of course, is the director of the Center for Tropical Research. He has done, for over 25 years, groundbreaking research right across the tropics, South America, Central America, but a special focus in the Congo Basin in West Africa, where he's established a UCLA center right in Cameroon, a center which not only tackles with conservation, but also deals with public health issues. I mean, we're taking lessons we learn here, the science here, and we're bringing it to some of the people that are probably least developed in the whole world in West Africa, and we're helping the people, not just the species, not just the natural environment here. And so we have a chance here to hear from somebody not only who's very accomplished, but is very, very passionate, has walked the walk, talked the talk, and done more than I think anyone I know in terms of his research and really helping people as well as the environment. Ladies and gentlemen, really a remarkable, remarkable person, someone I feel very proud to know as a colleague and a friend, Tom Smith.
So I'd like to especially thank the Oppenheim family for making tonight possible, in particular Tina and Pat Oppenheim for their tremendous support of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. It just means a lot. So thank you. The rainforests of the Congo Basin are tremendously rich in plants and animals, second only to the Amazon. Tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the region, the challenges, and some of the solutions for preserving biodiversity. In Cameroon, where I've worked, done research now for almost 30 years, the diversity is stunning. Similar in size to the state of California, Cameroon sits between Nigeria and the Central African Republic in the Gulf of Guinea. To the west is Mount Cameroon, Africa's third highest volcano, reaching almost 14,000 feet. To the north are the savannas that reach up to Lake Chad, and to the south are the lush tropical rainforests that form the northwest boundary of the Congo forest. Cameroon is one of the most biodiverse countries in Africa. Many of the country's plants and animals are found only there, nowhere else in Africa. It's home to a stunning array of birds, over 900 species, and over 300 species of mammals. Including is an extraordinary diversity of primates, over 29 different species of primates, from the very small red-eared guinean to the medium-sized putty-nosed monkey to two forest baboons, the mandrill and the drill, both critically endangered, but Cameroon is the only country where you find both of them. And of course, there's also great apes, such as chimpanzees and lowland gorillas. And also some extraordinary species, such as the cross river gorilla. This is a species that was discovered in the early 1900s. It turns out it's a subspecies of lowland gorilla, and it was thought to be extinct. Everyone thought it was gone, and then in the late 80s, they rediscovered it in some isolated mountains in Nigeria. There's only about 300 of these left. They're sort of the equivalent of the mountain gorilla of West Africa. In 1983, as a new graduate student, I traveled to the rainforests of southern Cameroon. This sort of tells you how long I've been doing this. At the time, there was one international airport in the port city of Douala and very few paved roads. Traveling the dirt road between Douala and Yaoundé was often a horrendous adventure, sometimes taking 2 days. It was only 150 miles. But over the years, I've worked in virtually every corner of the country, from some of the most remote rainforest areas to some of the savanna areas where we've worked, sometimes going in, taking 3 or 4 days, even a week to get into a single site to survey. But we were always rewarded by spectacular scenery. This is Ngong Ha. This is an isolated mountain range in central Cameroon. We were the first biologists to ever venture into this area, and we found many interesting discoveries there of plants and animals. Early on, I lived for 3 years in a tented camp near the small village of Ndibi. And I return to this site. I return to this site every year for the past 30 years, sometimes to do research. We still have projects there, but sometimes just to visit old friends. This is Etienne and his wife, Emilienne, and their daughter, Brenda, named after my wife. And I actually started working with Etienne when he was about 10 years old, and he was the best nest finder in the village. And this meant a lot to me for my dissertation, believe me. So we got to be great colleagues, and he just was a tremendous asset. He's now gone on to get a nursing degree, and he's practicing in Equatorial Guinea. Another place we've done long-term research is in the Jaw Reserve. This is what Tina mentioned. The Jaw Reserve is in south-central Cameroon. It's a biosphere reserve. It's one of the most spectacular tracts of rainforest you can imagine. We had a camp located about 30 kilometers from the nearest road where that star is. And we focused our research there on trying to understand the role that animals play in moving seeds and dispersing seeds. So we worked on both birds and primates. We had a camp at that site. This is what it looked like back in the early 90s, a fantastic spot. And we had graduate students working there 24/7. You could sit on this canopy in the evening and watch monkeys come down and swim in our swimming hole about 30 feet away. And they did that because they knew it was safe. They weren't afraid of us, but they were certainly afraid of the leopards that would often come down and try to nab them when they were taking a bath. This is the first team that worked out in the area. This is Ken Whitney, who is now a professor at the University of New Mexico, Mark Fogill, a botanist, and there are other assistants. But the most phenomenal people in this group, of course, are our Baka Pygmy guides, that we couldn't have done this project without them. They know every animal, every plant. They know every seedling of every plant, and they know every sound of the forest. They are the true forest people, and we wouldn't have had any chance of doing this project without them. This is Augustin, who was our chief guide back then. And we get back to this area too. Though we don't have the camp anymore, we still get back to do research in the area. This is Augustin 20 years later. This was taken last year in their village, Bouflong, and he's now the chief of the village. So while there's still tremendous biodiversity left in Cameroon, the situation is changing very fast. The exploitation of timber, oil, natural gas, and minerals is intensifying, and that means new roads and rail lines moving into pristine areas and increasing pressures on wildlife populations. The first scramble for Africa occurred between 1881 and 1914 and involved the invasion, occupation, and eventual annexation of African territory by European powers. Led in large part by China, a second scramble for natural resources is now underway, and Cameroon is in the crosshairs. If we just look at timber for a moment, China is the largest importer. If we look at deforestation here on the y-axis and Chinese imports, you see there's a very positive trend there. Wildlife trafficking is also a very serious problem for many species. Millions of metric tons are consumed annually in the Congo Basin. This hunter has some white-nosed, some putty-nosed monkey, and this is a mustache monkey. Elephants have been particularly hard hit by trafficking. It's estimated that over 30,000 elephants are killed every year in Africa. And believe me, this number is not sustainable. By weight, ivory now is more valuable than gold. Last year alone, there were 200 animals that were gunned down by rebel groups that came in across the border and killed 200 elephants in 2 days. But the environmental consequences of wildlife trafficking extend far beyond simply these loss of these wonderful animals. It turns out that most rainforest trees require animals to disperse their seeds. In fact, in Cameroon, about 85 to 90% of the trees are dispersed by vertebrates. And so when you lose these critical vertebrates, you lose the ability of the forest to regenerate. So in the case of elephants, they're really the king of the dispersers. They disperse over 100 species of tree. We've looked at this question. This is some work that one of my graduate students, Ben Wong, did here at UCLA for his thesis. And he looked at the impacts of hunting on a tree that's dispersed by primates. And he compared protected forest and hunted forest. The hunted forest, of course, is without primates, and the protected forests are with primates. And what he found was that in protected forest, most of the seeds are dispersed away from the tree, about 90%, whereas only a few percentage fall under the mother tree. Whereas in hunted forest, 95 or so % of the seeds fall under the parent tree and simply rot and aren't dispersed away. Now, the consequences of this are really quite significant because it means that these seeds are not being moved away, and we're seeing a contraction in genetic variation because of it. So genetic neighborhoods in this study, in the protected, what he found in the study was that genetic neighborhoods were 55% smaller in hunted forests. So this is a really serious matter when you start losing the capacity of these forests to generate and maintain genetic diversity. Another pressing problem, of course, is human population growth. African populations are expected to quadruple by the end of the century, and by 2050, global food needs are expected to rise about 100%. And the epicenter of agricultural growth in the tropics is going to be in places like Africa, in the tropics. So that's more land for people, less for wildlife. In sub-Saharan Africa, there is also a massive growth underway right now for mining. Much of it, again, led by China. The predicted growth of the middle class worldwide is estimated to approach about 5 billion in the next 17 years. And so this means that folks are going to want, the things that come along with being in the middle class. And so much of the natural resources to meet this demand are going to come from Africa. And this is a pretty stunning map of mining claims in southeastern Cameroon. So it's just this little bit of the country. These are mining claims. This is cobalt, iron ore, diamonds, etc. Some of these claims actually extend into the reserves, such as the Biosphere Reserve. Our camp is right there. Now, what has reduced the amount of, what's held this at bay in terms of just outright exploitation is the fact that it's very hard to move minerals out of Africa. You need to put it on trucks, you need to move it to the port, and you need to get it on ships. And so the logistics of doing that is slowed the pace of mineral development. But this is changing. Last July, while we were doing field work, Mark Gold and I and some others were down south of Kribi visiting one of my field sites, and we discovered to my horror that my entire field site had been basically eliminated. There's a deep water port that's being built. It extends 30 kilometers down the coast. It's probably about almost the size of the port of LA already. It's a massive port. It's one of the largest construction projects in Africa right now. And it will have rail links all the way into the deepest, darkest parts of Africa. So what does that mean for the Congo Basin? Well, what we did was to reconstruct the rail links that are going to connect to this port. This is what it looks like. It's basically a spider web reaching every country and into all parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, there's another port being constructed now in East Africa that's going to connect all of these rail lines. But these represent only a few of the challenges. This year, the world's CO2 surpassed 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, and the pace of climate change is now faster than any period in the past 65 million years of the history of the Earth. A fifth of all fossil fuels have been burned since 2002. And by 2020, 250 million people are predicted to face water shortages. The situation for biodiversity is pretty grave. It's estimated that if the global average temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, we look to lose probably about 30% of the plants and animals in Africa. If you've been reading the paper, you know there's a new climate report that's just come out. In fact, these estimates have been are now predicted to be even more than that. The predicted increase, even for a moderate scenario, is now 3 degrees. So this means that we're looking at a very serious situation for plants and animals. And in fact, for mammals, it's predicted that we may lose 40% of all African mammals by the end of the century. So what can we do? What can be done? How can we save Africa's biodiversity in the face of this onslaught and find sustainable solutions? What I'd like to do is to discuss 3 projects that we have underway that we think can make a difference for both people and biodiversity. But first, let me start with some background and focus on some of the threats of climate change and how they might be mitigated. Well, first of all, let's talk about the best way we can protect species in the face of climate change. How can we do this? Well, one of the ways that conservation organizations have focused is on hotspots. That is, protecting areas with a lot of species that are under threat and sort of focus your conservation efforts on these areas. The problem with this is that there's some problems with hotspots, and there are essentially 2 problems. The first is that under climate change, obviously the hotspots of today might not be the hotspots of tomorrow. Species are going to be changing in distributions. So for example, if we go back to look at what's happened in range shifts over the last 14,000 years, we can see that collared lemmings, which used to live in Montana, have moved up into the high Arctic, almost 1,600 kilometers. So that's the first problem, is that distributions are going to be changing. The second problem is that the hotspots themselves may not preserve the processes that give rise to biodiversity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you can imagine that you have a hotspot here again, but you may have an area outside of it in this red area, which is very important in the generation of new species. In other words, the processes that produce biodiversity may lay outside. And so you certainly wouldn't want to protect this area without this area. So what's a better way? What's a better way to try to protect, maximize the amount of biodiversity that we can protect under climate change? Well, one approach is to try to predict or protect as much adaptive variation as possible. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you can imagine a range of bird species here, some that feed on seeds and some that feed on nectar. And the idea here would be to protect as many of those different forms as possible with the hope that some of them are going to come out the other side. Some will persist in the face of climate change. Now, so this is really a sort of a balanced stock portfolio approach. You don't know what the future is going to bring, but you hedge your bets and you have a diversified portfolio. Now, this is much better than saying just protecting small-billed birds down here and hoping that you're going to get through into the future. This would be sort of the equivalent of just investing in tech stocks, I guess. So where is adaptive variation concentrated? Where can we find it? If we want to preserve it, where is it found? Well, it turns out that for the most part, adaptive variation is often concentrated along gradients, along ecological gradients. So when I speak of gradients, think about California for a minute. Think about as you drive from the foothills of the Sierras up into the high mountain meadows. You're moving across a vegetational gradient. Those habitats change as you drive up in elevation, and as you move up in elevation, those species that occur along that gradient change as well. They're under different selection pressures, so they change as those populations move up in elevation. You can think about it this way. This is Mount Cameroon. Imagine a small-bodied bird that lives at the base of this mountain. And as you hike to the peak of this mountain, you find that the species gets larger and larger. This is the variation I'm talking about. So in terms of protecting this area, what you would want to do is preserve an area from the top to the bottom of the mountain to try to capture as much of this variation as possible. So can protecting gradients offer a kind of bet-hedging strategy for preserving adaptive variation under climate change? Well, for the past 20 years, we've been focused on this question and the role of gradients in producing adaptive variation, but also their role in speciation, how new species emerge from this pattern of change across gradients. The gradient that we've been looking at, this is Africa, by the way. This is a vegetation map. And you can see the Congo Basin here, the Congo forest, and the savannas up here in red. And then this ecotone habitat between the savanna and the forest. And that's the gradient that we're talking about. It's called an ecotone. It's just a transition area between two biomes. Looking a little closer, you can zoom in and you can see that this transitional area or ecotone is made up of forest fragments of varying size floating in this sort of sea of savanna, which is shown here in pink. If we look at the different ends of this gradient, this would be typical of the forest area. So we would sample down in these areas working on birds. This is actually, by the way, this is along an elephant trail. You can see the elephant footprints, these post holes here. And you can actually use these trails to catch birds. It works really well. You don't have to clear trails, except if an elephant walks through. And then all bets are off. You lose another net, and the elephant's walking off with all your nets dangling behind it. The other end of the gradient looks like this. This is an ecotone fragment, a forest fragment here floating in this sea of savanna. If you go into this forest, you find many rainforest species that have been isolated there, but morphologically and physiologically they're different. They're living in this different environment. And so we were very interested in looking at this sort of progression of adaptive change across this gradient. So in the early 1990s, we started working on this species. This is the little green bull, pretty much the drabbest bird you can imagine in Africa. It's a very important species for two reasons. It's very, very common, and it's easily caught in mist nets, and so you can study it. And so we began a study of this species to try to understand how variation in this species changes along this gradient. So if we look at some data from little green bulls, if we look at morphological divergence on this axis, which is just some measure of wing length or bill size or leg length, and compare it to geographic distance along the x-axis, what we find is that when you compare different habitats across this gradient, such as forest and ecotone, the blue dots are up here. In other words, there's more morphological divergence per unit distance. Whereas if you look at within habitats, either forest-forest or ecotone-ecotone, they all sit down here. And so what this is telling us is that this divergence that's occurring across this ecotone, we're seeing changes in traits that we know to be important in the survival of these species. Now, we've done a lot of other work on this. We've looked at the genetic patterns of these changes along this gradient. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this, except to say that when you combine the genetic information with information on the morphology of the species, it's basically a pattern that's consistent with a theory of speciation based on over 40 years of laboratory work on fruit flies. In other words, what we're finding is that these gradients are very important not only in adaptive variation, but also in the progression to new species. Now, one way that you always want to look at species and try to, when you're studying evolution and speciation, is to try to understand the role of song. Because in bird song, it's really critical. We know birds sing different songs, and that reproductive isolation, what isolates different populations when birds are speciating often has to do with the type of song that they sing and so forth. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this study was to go out and record bird song and see how it was differing along the gradient and see how birds respond to different songs. So this is Hans Slauberkorn, a postdoc of mine, now a professor at Leiden, and Alex Kerschel, who did his PhD here at UCLA and is was one of Dan Blumstein's students. And so when you go into the forest, obviously, you turn your microphone on and you're hoping to record the bird in question, but you never know what you might record. And I was wondering if anyone recognizes this species. This is a bird that Hans recorded one morning. Well, I can assure you it was not a green bull. It was a lowland gorilla that was sleeping, and Hans stumbled upon it. Hans came back to the camp, and he was ashen. He was covered in mud, and we said, "What happened?" And he said, "I recorded a gorilla." And so we did what, of course, we were very interested in exactly what happened. So we took our Baca guides back to the site where Hans bumped into the gorilla and did a little jungle CSI. And what we learned, the Baca guides, what they learned is that what they told us was that actually the gorilla and Hans stood up, made 3 large paces, and both fell flat on their face, and then ran off in the opposite direction. So what does the song of the green bull really sound like? Well, here it is. So a beautiful song. And what we found was that the frequencies and delivery rate and these other characteristics of song were differing between the forest and the ecotone. And what this is telling us then is that the differentiation in song is a pattern that is very important in the reproductive isolation of these species. And so it turns out that green bulls from the ecotone don't recognize the birds from the forest. And so this is setting up a very important first step in the divergence to new species. So we've worked on green bulls now. We've looked at the same pattern along the gradient and other species, even chimpanzees. Katie Gonder did a wonderful study showing how chimpanzees are diverging along the gradient. We've looked at this in lizards. We've looked at it in other birds, such as this wattle-eye and this blue-billed weaver, all the same story. So showing that gradients are important for conserving adaptive variation is an important first step. But how do you begin to communicate this idea to the folks who are making decisions, about what areas to protect? Now, we struggled with this one, and it was back about 12 years ago, I guess. I was talking to a good friend of mine, Mark Reynolds, who's a senior scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and he said, Tom, it's actually quite simple. You just need to map it. If you can map it, you can conserve it. And so we said, okay, we'll try to map it. Well, that turned out to be a little more difficult than we thought. It took about 10 years to figure out how to do that. But we got a grant from NASA to try to do this in Ecuador. And so with funding from Ecuador, funding from NASA, we started working along the gradients along the Andes. Again, looking at the changes from the foothills up into the high mountains. And Ecuador was a great place to do this project for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a mega diverse country. There are over 25,000 species of plants, 1,600 species of birds, 350 species of mammals, etc. And it's also an area that's under, there's been a lot of deforestation. So between 84 and 97, there's very, very little forest that's been left in the western side of the Andes, only about 5% of the forest. So it was a good place to do this exercise to see if we could identify areas that we could preserve. And so what we did, this is a paper we published a few years ago. First of all, we identified pattern. That's sort of the old traditional way that conservation organizations do. They look at species richness, numbers of threatened species, and so forth. They come up with a prioritization. But we added to this whole question about process, about adaptive variation and where that's occurring. I'm not going to go through every little piece of this slide, but just get the idea that what we're doing is combining process and pattern. And we did this for a range of species. Bird species, frog species, some plant species, a bat species, and we put all of these together and we mapped it. And we discovered 3 things from this analysis. The first is that we found that adaptive variation is in fact concentrated along these gradients on both sides of the Andean chain here. This is shown in red. Secondly, we found that 20% of the processes occur in current protected areas, only 20%. So this is kind of bad news. We had hoped that there would be more of these gradients protected, but only 20% are. The protected areas are shown here in these black lines. The third thing we learned is that the gradients are also the ones predicted to be the most severely affected by climate change. And so these gradients are really key because that's where climate is going to be changing most rapidly. So now we've shown that we can successfully map both biodiversity pattern and process and put it in a form that managers can use, that decision makers can use, where we can start to make a difference. But this is only the first step. Having knowledge to solve a problem is just the first step towards a solution. But knowledge is not policy. So how do we bridge science and policy to really make this work? Well, universities need to be part of the solution. But too often, universities look like this. They're siloed. You know, the folks in engineering don't talk to the people in biology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big challenge. The other issue with universities is that they often build bridges, but they look more like this. The ivory tower is back here somewhere. We produce this wonderful knowledge. It rolls out on the drawbridge, and they say, read our papers. It's all there. And then the bridge goes back up, and that's it. Well, forget it. Another challenge is, we may build a bridge such as the infamous bridge to nowhere, but we talk the talk but don't walk the walk. So what kind of bridge do we need to build to really do this? Well, this is the kind of bridge I think we need to build. Now, everybody recognizes this as the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. This was built in the 9th century by the Medici family to connect both parts of Florence. But the bridge itself was a site of commerce. It was a site of action itself. Many shops and so forth. You may have even bought something on this bridge. So this is the Vecchian principle that we hope to, that we've been promoting, is that we must work at the intersection of knowledge and application and building bridges that are the site themselves of action. So what I'd like to do now is talk about 3 projects in which we're trying to build this kind of bridge in Central Africa. The first project is, a year and a half ago, we formed the Central African Biodiversity Alliance. It's made up of scientists, policymakers, and at 24 different universities in Africa, Europe, and the US. And the goal of the project is to develop an integrated framework for conserving African biodiversity in the face of climate change that's evolutionarily informed and grounded in the socioeconomic constraints of the region. And we were very lucky to get a $5 million 5-year grant from the National Science Foundation to push this forward. And we're just starting. We're about halfway through our 2nd year. There are 3 parts of this approach. The first is a research approach. The second is an education and training approach. And the third is a policy component. Now, the research I've sort of told you about already. It's similar to the Ecuador work that we're doing, but it's a little different. There are about 9 target taxa. We're working on everything from butterflies to chimpanzees. The steps in mapping adaptive variation look like this, and there's a couple of different aspects to this work. The first is that we're also looking at future climate change. We're actually developing predictive models about where species are going to be, what habitats are going to be where under different climate scenarios, so we can better prioritize areas to protect. The second is we're going to be taking socioeconomic issues into account. So for example, we might find that the best place for a new national park is down near Kribi, where they're building the Deepwater Port. Well, obviously, we wouldn't want to put one there. So we're trying to find that sweet spot where we can still protect biodiversity and do it in a context that's going to be workable. The second leg of this project is education, and this is one of the most exciting parts of this project. We have students from UCLA, other parts of US, coming together with African students, learning together to problem solve. This is a course we had in Gabon last year. It's this fantastic opportunity for training. We have folks get into the field and do research together. They build collaborations. And they, in this case, they even published a paper from their research together. This is Dennis Anye, very happily here, holding a chestnut-flanked sparrowhawk. I don't know if Gary or Joseph has seen one of these, but this is quite a rare species. And so this is some of the work that we're doing with the courses. The third part of this is policy. Now, how are we engaging the policymakers? Well, we're doing things a little bit differently. Rather than waiting until the end of the study to bring in a report and giving it to someone and saying, okay, here's our recommendations, we've started working with the policy people before we started the research. We sat down with them in Yaoundé, all 15 ministries. We did it at the Ministry of Higher Education, which is neutral ground, which is a great place to do that because, you know, there's a lot of competitiveness between ministries. But so we sat down, we presented the project we're doing, and we're working with these folks now as colleagues to try to put together better approaches for how to preserve areas, how to gazette new national parks. So have we been able to successfully do anything? Well, not yet. This project is just getting off the ground. But I want to tell you about one success story that did happen. And in the mid-1990s, we started this project working on gradients. And I was contacted. We published a very influential paper that got a lot of press. And we were contacted by World Bank. And they said, can you tell us more about these gradients? And we're working with ExxonMobil to build a pipeline, an oil pipeline from Chad to the coast. A $7 billion pipeline. It was the largest construction project in Africa at the time. And we want to do some mitigation, and maybe we should protect some of these gradients. We want to find out more about it. So we worked with World Bank over the course of about 2 years, and we and many other organizations were successful in having the government of Cameroon gazette a national park. This is the first ecotone park in Central Africa. It's 4,200 square kilometers. And it's just the rich area of this transition zone between forest and savanna. So we can do this. The second project focuses on the fundamental problem of higher education. Many of the best universities in Central Africa are collapsing. 44% of the population is under the age of 15. International development policies over the years have favored basic education over higher education. This is changing, but it's still pretty much the case. So what happens? The best and the brightest who leave these countries to go and get higher degrees basically never come back, or very few of them. In the case of Cameroon, only 20% of the folks that go overseas for higher degrees ever come back. So the question then is, where will the next generation of African experts to deal with these challenges come from? The current approach doesn't work on the university scale. We build great centers of international development, but they're in LA, in New York, in San Francisco. They're based in the US or Europe. And scholars will parachute in for 5 or 6 years, set up, do great work, but it's not permanent. It's not integrative. It's not what we need for the long term. And so we need a new approach. And so this new approach, we started 4 years ago. We decided, let's build a center that's both permanent and interdisciplinary. And permanent in the sense that this isn't going to go away, that it's going to be there in perpetuity, and interdisciplinary in that the sense that we want to get economists and epidemiologists and folks together to solve issues such as waterborne diseases, working together. The center that we created 4 years ago is here. It's shown here. It's the International Research and Training Center. It's a very modest operation right now. But so far we've had 1,000 scholars from 15 countries use this facility in the 4 years. And it's one-stop shopping. We help scholars get help scholars get research permits, We help them with logistics, but most importantly, we put them in touch with local researchers from the 7 universities so they can develop collaborative projects. And most importantly, this facility operates on a fee-for-use basis and operates in the black. So it's sustainable. You know, last month I think we earned an extra $1,000. We bought some light bulbs and some mattresses and some things. But it's working. But we need to take it to the next level. And so this is the next level that we're going forward with. We're very, very pleased. Working with Gensler, the architectural firm here in Los Angeles, is helping us design essentially a green campus. We're working with 4 other NGOs, the Centre Pasteur, the Institute for Tropical Agriculture, and the World Agroforest Center, combined over 200 years of experience on the ground. It includes facilities such as a distance learning center, a conference center, dormitories, and various laboratories. And so those folks at universities in Yaoundé and elsewhere won't have to leave the country, but can come and use these facilities and build collaborations. It's also a green facility. So working with Gensler and their architects, we are designing energy-efficient buildings. So instead of having concrete block buildings with AC running 24/7, this is actually sustainable. So it can be a model for what Africans can do with using local materials to build green facilities. The main areas of emphasis in this center will be on, at least initially, will be on water and health issues, food security, climate change, and biodiversity. These are just a list of some of the facilities. The Distance Learning Center is already underway. We have a course at UCLA in the School of Public Health being taught by Hilary Godwin this quarter, which has UCLA students and African students taking the same course in real time. It's a morning class at UCLA and a late afternoon class in Cameroon, but it's working. We also want to do some other things that are innovative. For example, we want to create a repair facility for repairing lab equipment. Now you would think, well, why do you need that? Well, it turns out that if you're a scientist in the US and you have a centrifuge that doesn't work, you might say, well, geez, I'm going to buy a new one, I can send this to Africa and hopefully someone can use it. Well, that's great. But if it breaks after 2 years, there's nobody to fix it. And so what we want to do is create a repair facility to repair this sort of equipment. I was visiting a colleague recently at the University of Buea. I was walking through his lab, and I said, geez, Eric, that's a pretty nice spectrophotometer. And he said, it is. It hasn't worked in 10 years, but I keep it here just in case a student sees one, and he'll know what it is. So we need to change the game here. And the other thing we want to do, we're working with a group in Silicon Valley to provide a test bed for new innovative technologies. Okay, how about dipstick technologies for diagnosing diseases? There's all sorts of tremendous potential here, but you have to field test this stuff. And so we want to have a test center. And so that's another part of it. So we're in full fundraising mode for this, but we're hopeful that this is going to take place. And this is just the phase 1 build out. The second phase is even more exciting. I wish I had more time to tell you about it. Finally, the third project takes us back to the jaw and how we're working to protect this magnificent piece of rainforest. Last year, we went back to the jaw, and unfortunately, things aren't going so well right now. The NGO that was managing things has pulled up stakes, ran out of money. Again, the cycle of boom and bust in NGO world. And this is a common sight now. This is a mustache monkey and a female black-cast hornbill hanging on a stick for sale. So what we're trying to do is, in this project, is we're trying to develop a way to protect the jaw by developing a RED project. Now, what's a RED project? RED project, RED stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Turns out that about 20% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases come from deforestation when we cut down a forest. And so the RED project, the RED program, was first created by the United Nations to reduce forest loss in return for protecting forests and doing reforestation and helping local people find green jobs and protecting biodiversity and so forth. And for this, they could earn funds through the sale of carbon credits. Now, if systematically pursued, REDD projects have the potential to address both climate change and the preservation of the world's forests. The funds for the protection of the forests will come from nations and industries that purchase credits on the carbon market, such as the one recently established in California, the carbon reduction law. So this is the concept for this REDD program. This is the jaw. This is the main reserve. The buffer zone around this jaw is going to be included in this REDD project, and it constitutes 5,000 square miles. Okay, 5,000 square miles. That's 2,000 square miles larger than Yellowstone National Park. This is a major, major area of forest. It would sequester large amounts of carbon. And importantly, we have government approval. We're the first REDD project in Cameroon where all the ministries came together and actually approved us to go forward. So we're very, very excited about this. We're moving forward. The duration of this particular project is probably 50 years. It may in the end be 100 years, but it will generate revenues from the sequestering of carbon. It aims to sell about 68 million verified carbon units. A carbon unit is about 1 ton of carbon. 30% of the profits will go to community development funds. 15% will go to the Republic of Cameroon. 25% will go to investors. And 30% will go back to the NGOs, Forest Live and our NGO, that we can then put back into new REDD projects and things like the Center for Integrative Development and building that out. So we're very excited about that. Much of the success of this, of course, is going to depend on the carbon market. Unfortunately, the carbon market has been all over the place. It's been as high as almost $35. Now in Europe, it's about $1.50. So there's uncertainty here with respect to the carbon market, but even at low levels of even $2 a ton, this project is doable. But we need to do a lot more. I mean, right now, if you look at subsidies for oil, they're $480 billion. You add, it's over $500 billion if you add biofuels to that. Right now, there's about $1 billion going into REDD projects. We hope by 2020 there'll be $30 billion. But I think things are changing. I mean, this is a piece from the New York Times published back in December. It turns out that more than 24 of the nation's largest corporations, including 5 of the major oil companies, all the major oil companies, are planning their future growth on the expectation that the government will be forced to basically will basically force them to put a price on carbon pollution to control global warming. So if we can make this happen, the REDD project, we have a chance that we can protect this magnificent biodiversity of the jaw, its fantastic species, but also its people. And so working together, I sincerely hope that we can make the next scramble for Africa about sustainability, both for its people and for its biodiversity. With that, I'd like to thank all of the folks that contributed to this project, too many to name individually, and the various funders that have given us funding over the years. Thank you very much.